Hello, everyone. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Crystal Chumney, and I'm the Manager of Public Services here at New Canaan Library. We're delighted to have you join us this evening to hear Aida Mansoor talk to us about women in Islam. Aida has been doing presentations about Islam since 1999. She is committed to building bridges of understanding and was president of the Muslim Coalition of Connecticut, which is a nonprofit dedicated to this purpose. She is a board member of the Connecticut Council for Interreligious Understanding and has been awarded the Human Relations Award from the National Conference for Community and Justice in 2011. At this time, kindly silence your cell phones. And I said kindly, you know. And please join me and welcome Aida to the stage.
I have to move it right down because I'm so short. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much. It's lovely to see these smiling faces looking at me. So I'm here to speak to you about women in Islam. And from the very get-go, I just want you to know that if there is a burning question that you have, please don't hesitate to put your hand up. I mean, I don't mind having questions at the end, but if there is a burning question that you have, please, interrupt me, and I'll try my best to answer. Okay, so here we are, women in Islam. So one of the things that happened before 9/11 is that people were looking at public perceptions about Muslims. So this was before 9/11, okay? And it was a Yale study. And basically what they did is they asked the whole nation, as many people that they could find, first of all, if they knew a Muslim personally. And if the answer was yes, then they weren't included in the study. Because it was about perceptions. If the answer was no, the next question was, what words come to mind when you hear the word Islam or when you hear the word Muslim? And so this horrible list was drawn up as a result of that study. So the perception is that Muslims are terrorists, they're violent, they're fanatical. About women, that women are oppressed, they're submissive, they are uneducated, they cannot work, they're foreign, that they don't speak English. I hope I disprove that one. That they're not our friends, they're undemocratic, they're intolerant, and they're backward. A horrible list. And this is from people who have never actually met a Muslim. So where do you think they get these perceptions from? I tend to agree with you. Yes, so number one, the media, okay? And I'll give you a brief description of the media in terms of one short story, and that is the story of the Washington sniper. In 2002, there was a gentleman who decided that he was going to kill a lot of people in DC. He hid himself in the back of a car, he drilled a hole in the back, and put his gun out and basically shot people indiscriminately. And I remember wanting to go to DC that time, and I thought, not this year, because it was a very scary time. 2002 was really scary. And then he was caught, and everyone breathed a sigh of relief, and he was sentenced in 2006. And in 2006, the headline in the newspaper said, John Muhammad, recent convert to Islam, and then all the horrible, horrible things he had done. And for me as a Muslim, I read the article, and the first thing that my reaction was, why are they mentioning the fact that he's a Muslim? Because in that very same newspaper, there was another Muhammad who had just won the Nobel Peace Prize, and nothing about his faith was mentioned. So this just shows the bias that we have in our media, and it was because it was in the same newspaper that it was so blatant. But I would urge you all, watch, CBS, NBC, Fox News, CNN, but also watch BBC World, watch Al Jazeera English. I got some thumbs up for BBC World. Okay, Al Jazeera English, and see what the main story is and how it is different from our media that we have. So that's an important thing to do. Another source of perceptions is Hollywood. There are a number of Hollywood movies where the bad guy or girl is either Arab, Muslim, or both. When I was growing up, and you probably know how old I am when I tell you this, when I was growing up, the bad guy was usually always Russian. And before that, the bad guy was African American. And before that, the bad guy was Native American. And it's a shame that we have a group to love to hate. And so that's one of our frustrations as a mother. You know, my children are watching all these movies, and the bad guy is someone that they may identify with, and that's a little shocking for me. An example of a Hollywood movie, a very common, well-known one that it's a beautiful movie, very colorful. Robin Williams is the genie, is Disney's Aladdin. And if you actually watch it with a critical eye, there are some issues. There was an article recently that said that Aladdin, the face of Aladdin, was based off Tom Cruise. And you just wonder who the face of Jafar, the evil character, was based off. But he looks very foreign. He speaks in a different way. And when the film came out initially, some years ago, when it was on in theaters, it started with this song called Arabian Nights. Okay, and the song initially had the lines in it that if those people in Arabia over there see you and they don't like the look of you, they will cut off your ear. If you buy the video today, those particular lines have been taken out, but you can actually Google it on YouTube and see both versions, and it's very interesting to see that. As a result of that Hollywood movie, the Council for American Islamic Relations, CAIR, was one of the organizations that actually said, please take this out. There are it's very sort of insulting to Arabs, and it's just not right. And so they listened. But there are a number of Hollywood movies today where the bad guy is an Arab, Muslim, or both. And I have a friend whose best friend is an Arab. He's an actor. He cannot get a job unless he's cast as a terrorist. And not just terrorist 1, but maybe terrorist 4 or 5. And now, of course, they're running out of olive-colored Arabs actors, and so they're asking people who are Latino to run from a burning building and shout some Arabic phrase. So it's really quite sort of shocking, actually. Another source of perceptions is cultural practices of some Muslims, and I'll give you an example of that. And I'll give you one of my examples. So. You can probably tell by my accent I was born in England. And when I got married, I changed my name. And then I came to this country and I went to the mosque in Berlin, in Hartford actually. And I sort of was greeted by all the women in the community, and they all were very happy to see me. They welcomed me with open arms, and they asked me my name. And I said, my name is Aida Mansoor. And they said, oh, so your father is Mansoor? And I said, no, my husband is Mansoor. They were horrified. They said, you changed your name? This is who you are. And I never realized until that point that it wasn't an Islamic practice to change your name. It's an Islamic practice for a woman to keep her name. To me, it's like a feminist practice. And so I only learned that when I came to this country, and I realized I didn't do what I was supposed to do. But it was too late. I had already changed my name on my passport. And so there's a lot of times when you'll have a family and the mother has her own last name and the kids may have her husband's last name. But it just shows you how strong a woman's identity should be and should be supported. Another example of cultural practices of some Muslims, originally my parents come from Sri Lanka, which is a beautiful island south of India. It's like 6 degrees away from the equator. The majority in Sri Lanka are Buddhist. The next population up are Hindu, and then there are 7% Muslims and 7% Christians. And the Muslims in Sri Lanka had a practice where if they had a daughter who was of marriageable age and they wanted a good guy for their daughter, they would have to amass a lot of money in order to get a good bridegroom. So there was a dowry system. And what was ironic about that is when you actually look at the Islamic practice, we don't really have a dowry system, but we have a thing called mahar, where the bridegroom gives the bride a gift. which is completely the other way around. And fortunately for me, my husband knew this. And so my family didn't have to pay up, thank goodness. But now, with time and with people knowing their faith, these practices and these cultural practices are now kind of sort of diminishing. Another example of cultural practice, people actually ask me, they say, oh, I'm so, can you drive? We know that women in Saudi Arabia, have got permission to drive in the summer. They're going to start driving in the summer. And they presume that it is an Islamic practice, but I've driven for 30 years. So the rule is, if it's done all over the world, then it's usually a religious practice. If it's done by in some areas and not in others, then it's usually a cultural practice. A very stark example of cultural practice is FGM, female genital mutilation, which is an awful and very invasive practice that happens in certain countries. And if you go to Guinea, for instance, the women in Guinea, the Muslim women in Guinea, the Christian women in Guinea, the tribal people in Guinea, the women, have this practice. It's a cultural practice and not an Islamic one. I have been Muslim all my life, and I never heard about it until I watched the news. So it's something to be aware of, where culture and religion are very, very different. The Islamophobia network is another source of perceptions. Every election cycle, the hate rhetoric against Muslims rises dramatically. It's still rising. It rose in 2008, it rose in 2012, it rose in 2016, and it's still rising, unfortunately. And an excellent reference is, if you look at Fear Inc., if you Google Fear Inc. Islamophobia, there's an excellent document that talks about the Islamophobia network. It actually looks at people who have an axe to grind against Muslims in terms of misinformation, and it looks and sees where their funding is coming from, and it's a very interesting read. I'll give you an example of what an Islamophobe does. So basically, one time I was in Health Tracks trying to get fit. Health Tracks is a gym, and you know how the gyms have like monitors in front of you? So I was there on the elliptical, and there was a monitor in front of me, and it was a couple of years ago. President Obama was introducing a speaker in the Rose Garden of the White House. And the speaker came to the podium, and he started his speech. He was Muslim. He started his speech by saying, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, which means in the name of the one God, the most gracious, the most merciful. I said it to myself just before I started talking today. People will say it before they eat. It's something that it's just a mentioning of God's name. It's something every Muslim knows. And so this guy said this in the beginning of his speech, and the terrorism expert on Fox News said, this is the war cry of the Muslims. They have taken over the Rose Garden. And so this is the sort of misinformation. If you don't know a Muslim personally, to ask, that's going to be a scary thing to hear. And so this is the frustration for many of us, many Muslims in the world, where there's a lot of misinformation. The final one, hate rhetoric by certain groups. There are certain groups that hate Muslims. One group, of course, is the KKK. This is an ad from the KKK. It says, the KKK wants you. And then down at the bottom it says, help us fight the spread of Islam in our country. They have a hotline, they have a website. But the shocking thing is that, for me, is that they think they can get people by saying how they want to get rid of me, which is really, a little sad, but anyway. This is a book by Jack Shaheen called Guilty, where he actually reviews 100 Hollywood movies finding that Arabs and Muslims continue to be portrayed as terrorists, etc. And it's a good reference if you're interested in that kind of thing. So, in terms of the movies, this is basically how Muslim women are portrayed. If you Google the words Muslim women, this is the kind of picture or images. This is the kind of thing you'll see. This is really the stereotype. Okay, and I'm going to try and convince you in an hour to not think of this, but to think of something else when you think of Muslim women. So let's start right at the beginning with the description of Adam and Eve, the creation. It says here the Quran describes the creation of Adam and Eve and relates the story of how Satan tempted them both to eat from the tree. They both sinned equally, okay, and repented when they knew what they had done. So Eve and Adam were equally, to blame. So that the concept of Eve being in collusion, I like the word collusion now, but anyway, being in collusion with Satan or being a temptress is totally foreign to Islamic belief. And this is the quote from the Quran. God said, "Get you down all from here, and if, as is sure, there comes to you guidance from me, whosoever follows my guidance, on them shall be no fear, nor shall they grieve." And this is from the second chapter of the Quran, the 38th verse. So basically, both men and women are equally responsible and accountable for their actions according to the Quran. There are many, many verses where men are mentioned and then women are mentioned right next to it. And it's important to note that just like in Spanish, if you have a group of men and women in a room, it takes the male plural. Okay, so when you read a translation of the Quran, if it has the male plural in it, it usually includes the females as well. But in a lot of the verses in the Quran, it has the male plural and then it says the female plural as well. So we're mentioned twice, with the men and with ourselves. So that's pretty cool. But it says here, the believers, men and women, are protectors one of another. They enjoin what is just and forbid what is evil. They observe regular prayers, practice regular charity, and obey God and his messenger. On them will God pour forth his mercy, for God is exalted in power wise. And that's the 9th chapter of the Quran. And here's another one. And this verse is usually recited during weddings, and you'll see why. It says, "And among his signs is this, he created for you mates from among yourselves, that you may dwell in tranquility with them, and he has put love and mercy between your hearts. Verily in that are signs for those who reflect." And this one, which really illustrates men and women as being equal, this is the verse in the Quran, and it says, "Indeed, the Muslim men and the Muslim women, the believing men and the believing women, the obedient men and the obedient women, the truthful men and the truthful women, the patient men and the patient women, the humble men and the humble women, the charitable men and the charitable women, the fasting men and the fasting women, the men who guard their modesty and the women who do so, and the men who remember God often and the women who do so. For them, for men and women, God has prepared forgiveness and a great reward." Again, emphasizing the equity between men and women in the sight of God. And in the Prophet Muhammad's last sermon, he actually said, "You have rights over your wives, and your wives have rights over you." And I have to say, a lot of times that second bit of the sentence is forgotten, and that's a real problem that we have to talk about. He also said, "Treat women well and be kind to them, for they are your committed partners and helpers." And at another time, he said, "The strong man is the one who does not use force, but who controls his anger." And this is one of the hadith that I actually quote to my husband daily if I can. It says, and he's so tired of me, it says, "The most perfect of you in faith is the best in morality, and the best of you is the one who is best to his wife." And I looked at the Arabic, and it is gender specific. It says wife. It doesn't say spouse. So it's an important tradition to remember. So when the Quran was revealed in the 7th century, around 632 and before Common Era, there were many rights awarded to women in the Quran. And we see that, it says here, the Quran revealed during the 6th century gave women legal rights of inheritance and divorce, which really women in the West would only receive much later. And it's really interesting. There's a really sort of incredible woman called Fatima el-Fihri. I think this is her next slide after this. But she was the one who inherited wealth in the 800s. And she was the one who actually put her money towards the first degree-granting university in the world, in the Al Qarawiyyin University in Fez in Morocco. And it was her. It was a woman, a Muslim woman, who set it up because she could inherit wealth. And it says here, it also established the right to select their leader and publicly declare so. And you just contrast that with the suffrage movement. But then if you look at, sort of Arabia or countries today, of course things have gone downhill in terms of, women are only just, I think in 2015 in Saudi Arabia, they had the right to vote. But actually they had the right to select a leader at the beginning of, in the 600s. So things have definitely kind of declined for a reason. This is the Al Qarawiyyin University in Fez. It says here, recognized by the Guinness Book of World Records and UNESCO as the oldest degree-granting university in the world. Now, if you think about, I'm just trying to take you back to the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him. Women were a really dynamic part of the society. There's, businesswomen like Khadija, the wife of the Prophet, who actually was the one who asked him to marry her. She was a wealthy businesswoman, and she was a vital part of the society. Zubaydah was an example of a woman who was involved in philanthropy. Fatima, the daughter of the Prophet, was involved in education. Aisha, the wife of the Prophet, was a legal scholar. She actually transmitted over 2,000 narrations. So a well-known legal scholar. Nusayba is well known for having fought in the battlefield and sustained, sort of wounds trying to protect the Prophet. So all these women are examples of women at that time. But as it says here, the condition of women has never been uniform. It's never been monolithic. And there's this Islamic humanist called Al-Jahid who recognized the fact that the condition of women had rapidly deteriorated since the prophetic period. And the question is why? And to answer that question, I really came, to 5 reasons. The first one is the Orientalist legacy. The second one is the colonialist, and I'll go through each one. The third one is the fact that Quranic commentary is and was exclusively the domain of Muslim men. There were women scholars, but they weren't translated and they weren't supported as much. Cultural practices superseding Islamic practice. We've already talked a little bit about that. And I think most importantly today, the withdrawal of education of women so that they are not aware of their rights. That's something that's we need to fight for. I was homeschooling my daughter for a year, and part of her curriculum included British literature. And in that, I was sent all these textbooks, and one of them was on British literature, and it had the epic poem of the Song of Roland. I don't know if you are aware of the Song of Roland, but it was originally in French and then translated into English. And it's this poem about this great guy called Roland, and he's killed by these Muslims. And you read through the thing, and as a Muslim, it's really it's a downer. It's pretty sad, because he's such a great guy, and these Muslims just bring him down, kind of thing. But what was interesting for me was when I read the introductory paragraph, and that said that actually in real life, Roland was not killed by Muslims. He was killed by the Basques in Spain. But this was just before the First Crusade in 1099. And so this was written as a way to kind of rally the troops. And I think it's maybe the first example of spin. I don't know, but it since that time and to today, there is a lot of spin, and so this is just an example of that. So really, Orientalists, they had their own account of Islam and represented, or actually misrepresented, the Islamic world as a domain that was inferior. If you look at National Geographic publications from the late 1800s, you'll see how they'll never have the word Muslim in it. They'll say Mohammedan. And they refer to Muslims as, not quite human. Anyone who is not white actually is not quite human. But this is kind of their story. So basically, it says here the Victorian colonial powers used, of course, their policy of divide and rule. They used the language of feminism to criticize religions and cultures of others, particularly of Islam, in order to give an aura of moral justification. And at the same time, they tried to combat feminism within their own society. And an example of this is Lord Cromer. This guy is a very interesting character. He was a Victorian imperialist, and he lived in Egypt in sort of the 1840s, sort of early 1900s. And he actually was very interesting. He was greatly influenced by the Orientalists of his time. He believed that Islam and its society was inferior to European society. And he saw it most evident in the way that women covered, in the way that women veiled. And he said it was essential to eliminate veiling to put a stop to Islam's degradation of women as he saw it. And he wanted to help women with his policies, but actually what he did, and when you look at his record, it really was detrimental to the Egyptian women of that time. Number one, he restricted girls' education, women's education, by increasing only the girls' school fees. And that's, there are papers about that. There was also this midwifery school that he closed down, stating that the civilized world should only have doctors who were men. And what's interesting is, in England, Lord Cromer was a founding member and president of the Men's League for opposing women having the right to vote. So he's definitely got an agenda here. We can see that. This quote is just so, sort of shocking. But anyway, I'll read it to you. He said, this is what Lord Cromer said. He said, "Feminism on the home front and feminism directed against white men was to be resisted and suppressed. But if it were taken abroad and directed against the cultures of colonized people, it could be used to further the dominance of the white man." Okay. So that's basically, so I'm going to talk a little bit about that later, but in terms of the headscarf and how we perceive the headscarf today. But let's go to the another reason why I feel that, women things have declined. So the next one is in terms of the Quranic commentary being exclusively the domain of men, and this has happened for 15 centuries. The thing is, when you translate, so I'll just talk about a little bit about the population of Muslims around the world. There are 1.7 billion Muslims in the world, and out of that 1.7 billion, 18% speak Arabic, and 82% do not. Which means that 82% of us, including me, unfortunately, rely on a translation. And we rely on the translator, and the translator probably has a little bit or even more of baggage. And so things like the word spouse, which is non-gender specific, is translated as wife or husband. Human being is translated as men. And so the nice thing is that we still have the Arabic to go back to, so we can check it. But a lot of people just rely on a translation, and that can be problematic. I thought I would talk a little bit about why some Muslim women cover their head. Basically, it's being in a state of prayer. The majority of Muslim women who pray, when they pray, they cover their hair. And it says here it is a requirement for prayer as it shows respect for God, and it is a devotional practice. And if you look at the actual Quranic verses regarding, sort of this kind of thing, it's actually regarding modesty. And it says, this is two quotes that really talk about this. It says, "And say to the believing women that they should lower their gaze and guard their modesty, that they should not display their beauty and ornaments except what ordinarily appear thereof, and that they should draw their veils over their chest area." And in another verse it says, "O Prophet, tell your wives and daughters and believing women that they should cast their outer garments over their bodies when abroad, so that they should be known and not molested." Okay, so really those are the two verses in the Quran that talk about modesty. And different women have different interpretations. Many of us who wear the headscarf will say, well, the scholars, recommend that we cover our hair. My mum, when she was growing up in Sri Lanka as a child, her parents were pretty, sort of rigid and said, you need to cover your hair. And so she did. Even the cars had curtains so that people couldn't see in if they were traveling. It was so, sort of strict. And when it was time for her to get married, she got married and she said, "I'm not doing this anymore." And so she ditched her headscarf. She was a bit of a rebel. She ditched her headscarf, and I think that's because she was forced to do so. I have to say, though, that she is a much better Muslim than I am. It's the Islam is not in the cloth that you wear on your head. It's really in your heart. And when I see her, I can see how her face shines when she mentions God, and so that's really an inspiration for me. So it's not really. I mean, people will say, well, if you're more religious, you will wear a headscarf. Really, it's what's in your heart that really, really counts. For me, I started wearing a headscarf when I was expecting my first child. It was a very spiritual time for me. My husband was doing his internship at that time, and he was a chief resident at that time. And when I started wearing my headscarf, his boss, who was a woman, had seen me without my headscarf and said to him, "Why are you forcing her to wear that thing?" When, poor guy, it was my decision completely, and I felt very guilty. So I actually went and spoke to her and said, "Really, it's my decision. It's a common thing to think that men force their wives to wear, and there are some crazy men who do that, but then it's not an act of faith. If you don't choose to wear it, it is not an act of faith." So there are some countries who say you have to wear it. There are some countries that say you cannot wear it, and they're both wrong. And that's the beauty of being in this country and having the choice to do so. I joke with my mom, and I tell, when I was young, I was growing up in, we traveled a lot, and I was living in Zambia, which is Central Africa. And I was 5 years old, and my parents were looking for a school to send me to that was only girls. And the only girls' school they could find in the whole of the town was the local convent school, the Dominican convent school. So they actually sent me to this school. I was the only Muslim in, the whole class was Catholic. And once in a while they'd pray over me because I hadn't been baptized. But generally they were a beautiful, beautiful crowd and I tell my mom, you sent me to this convent where the nuns wore the full habit. I'm going to cover my head as well, because it was just a joke, but, she kind of laughed that one off. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about, so this is the quote for women. And I wanted to mention this hadith about knowledge. It says, "Acquire knowledge," the Prophet would tell his followers. "Seeking knowledge is the duty of every Muslim, male or female. It will befriend you in solitude. It will guide you to happiness. It will sustain you when you are in misery. It will adorn you when you are amongst people, and it will be your shield and protect you against those who attack you. Whosoever goes out in the search of knowledge is on the path of God until returning." So it just proves how important education is. And the reason I have this particular, it's a very strong hadith. The reason I have this hadith or narration or tradition in my PowerPoint is because many people see the Taliban and they see Boko Haram. And these are groups that do not like women having an education. But this is a very strong hadith. And so it just shows you how ignorant these people are of their own faith. It's vital that women have an education. And, the story of Malala Yousafzai, she was shot because she wanted that. It just goes to show how ignorant terrorists are, actually. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about, so there was these two quotes for women. And, I said just now how important knowledge is. I have a friend who is a scholar. She speaks fluent Arabic. She's a Hafid Quran, which means she knows the whole Quran by heart. And an amazing person. And one day she was in a marketplace, and I think it was the United Arab Emirates, I think. I could be wrong, but it was in one of those countries. And she went to a market, and she picked up a fruit, a peach, and she asked the seller, how much is this in Arabic? And she was dressed like me. She had, unfortunately, a little bit of hair coming out by accident, quite by accident. And she was asking this question. She wasn't aware of it, and so she was asking the question, how much is this peach? And he turned to her, he looked at her, he saw this little bit of hair coming out, and he pointed at her and said, "You are going to hell." Okay? And I think if that had happened to me, I probably would have said, "Here's your peach, I'm leaving," or, gone. But she was educated. She knew her faith. She knew the Quran, and, she's an excellent scholar. And so she recited the verse in the Quran that comes actually before the women are discussed. And so this is what she recited to this guy. She said, "Say to the believing men that they should lower their gaze and guard their modesty. That will make for greater purity for them, and God is well acquainted with all that they do." Which just goes to show, when we quote the Quran, we're actually quoting God. And so this guy really didn't have a leg to stand on. And that's really this is what education does. It protects us. Because there's a lot in the Quran that protects women, if only we knew it. And that's probably one of the reasons why these terrorist groups and these people who need control don't want women to have education, because they'll have to give up some of the control. But it was just a great example of the need for education. Yes, please.
Maybe you could explain a little bit what the Hadith are.
Oh, sure. Yes. Yeah, so I did actually explain Hadith last time, so I apologize. So as Muslims, we have two sources. We have the Quran, which we believe is the word of God, and we have the Hadith, which are the traditions of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And there are, many, many Hadith. But within the Hadith, there are strong Hadith. And the way a Hadith is transmitted, it'll say, somebody said that somebody said that somebody said that somebody said that the Prophet said this, okay? And if all those somebodies are reliable and, if they're sort of genuine and reliable, then it's known as a strong Hadith. If one of those people in the chain are a little dodgy, in other words, if, say, it says somebody said to somebody and those two people weren't around at the same time, so they couldn't have spoken, then it's known as a weak hadith or a fraudulent hadith. And an example of a fraudulent hadith is the one that if you kill someone, you get 72 virgins in the next world. That is a completely fraudulent hadith. I never heard it until I accidentally watched Fox News. But that's what the terrorists and the Islamophobes love to mention. They love to mention that one. But it is a fraudulent hadith. Okay, but thank you so that's what the hadith is. So this is actually a strong hadith that I mentioned about how important education is. Okay, yes.
They have to go through a whole system of proving.
Yes, of checks.
Say that it's sahih.
Yes, sahih means it's genuine and reliable and real. Yes, thank you, strong. Thank you. Okay, so in terms of the hijab, I actually did a very interesting study when I was doing my master's at the Harvard Seminary, and I asked several people who wore the hijab why they did so. And many said it's an act of faith, a devotional practice. Many said it's a way of preserving modesty. Many said when wearing hijab, one is in a state of prayer, and so one is reminded of God. Another person said, our beauty as women is not for public consumption. And this is one of my favorites. This lady said, in public, many Muslim women want to be known by their intellect in preference to their beauty. I love that one. And I wanted to add, if only we could only wear the headscarf if we got a PhD, it would mean so much more, right? So it's interesting. And of course, it should be a choice. Only then can it be an act of faith. I know for myself, before I wore my headscarf, everyone thought I was a Latina, and they'd speak to me in Spanish, and of course I don't speak a word of Spanish. But I remember being in a line in New Britain in Connecticut, and And there was, a gentleman in front of me, and he turned to me and he spoke to me in Spanish and really fast. And I didn't know what he was saying. And I said, "I'm really sorry, I don't speak Spanish." And he was horrified. He said, "You turned your back on your culture?" And then he gave me this long lecture about how I should learn my own language. And then I, of course, explained to him, well, I come from, I was born in England and like all this stuff. And he was very, very apologetic and very, very nice to me after that. But it just goes to show. And then after I started wearing my headscarf, people asked me the question, "Oh, you speak English. Where did you learn to speak English?" So it's interesting, what a little piece of cloth can do. But I have to say that after I started wearing my headscarf, I have to say I'm on my best behavior, because people who see me make judgments about Muslims. And so I tell this, it's a joke really, but I really do this. When I go to Stop and Shop and I have my cart full of stuff, I empty my car and I always put my cart away. If I didn't have this, I'd probably leave it in the middle of the street somewhere. So you're lucky, people are lucky that I'm just like this. But a lot of people will say, that Muslim women in particular who wear the headscarf are a target for people who hate Muslims. And so it can be a huge challenge for many women. Many women, don't go out late because they fear, some kind of backlash. So it's really, it's something to be thinking about. I love this ad. So this says, "We don't care what's on your head, we care what's in it." It's interesting to note that, when you saw that perception slide, that we're known for terrorism, but although we're 1 to 3% of the population in America, we are 10% of physicians. So it's important to realize that we really are a healing. We should be known for healing because we have disproportionately more doctors among Muslims. The issue is that when you go to see your doctor, they're not going to say, "I'm a Muslim, can I take your blood pressure?" They're just going to do that work. So just bear that in mind. They could be Muslim. And this is my favorite slide of all. This is a slide of Zari. She is the first Muslim Muppet, and it says, "Sesame Street unveils hijab clad Muppet," and Zari is a feminist from Afghanistan. Very cool. And she's got this lovely smile, and she's very colorful, and I just love her. Yeah, she's cute. So anyway, if you think about covering your head, it's in most traditions. If you think of the Jewish rabbinic literature of Judaism, it says, "It is not like the daughters of Israel to work with their heads uncovered." I actually looked up headscarf. I wanted to get some headscarves for myself, and it took me to a Jewish site, and I thought this is really interesting. Many Orthodox Jewish women cover their hair with a scarf, or they wear wigs over their hair, and for the same reason. And many actually wear wigs after they get married, but it's for modesty. And then in terms of biblical scripture, it says in Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, "Every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. It is just as though her head were shaved." And I know a lot of my friends, if you think of Mother Teresa, she's wearing a hijab, okay, and a lot of my friends' parents, when they went to church in the 60s and 70s, they would cover their hair with they'd either wear a hat or they would have a lace, handkerchief, so it's really in all our traditions. So it's in that tradition. One of the reasons why we wear the headscarf is also because of the most important woman for Muslims, and that is Mary, the mother of Jesus, peace be upon her. And she is usually depicted, sometimes not, but most of the time she's depicted with her head covers, as that really shows her how devout she was. If you think about Mary, I had a quote about Mary here. The 19th chapter of the Quran is called Maryam, after Mary, the mother of Jesus. And this is the direct quote. It says, "Behold, the angel said, O Mary, God hath chosen thee and purified thee, chosen thee above the women of all nations. Behold, the angel said, O Mary, God giveth thee glad tidings of a word from him. His name will be Christ Jesus, the Son of Mary, held in honor in the world and the hereafter, and of the company of those closest or nearest to God. He, this is Jesus, shall speak to people in childhood and in maturity, and he shall be of the company of the righteous. She said, Mary said, O my Lord, how shall I have a son when no man hath touched me? And he said, even so, God creates what he wills. When he hath decreed a plan, he but saith to it, be, and it is. There are beautiful stories of Mary, the mother of Jesus, peace be upon her. And, sort of when she's just had the baby, she's told to not speak to anybody, and that her baby son, will defend her from the cradle. It's beautiful. There are, beautiful stories about Mary, Maryam, peace be upon her. So basically, she is described as someone with great faith and purity. She was chosen by God above all other women, and of course, she has a great position in Islam. There's a hadith that talks about the 4 greatest women ever in Islam. Maryam is, of course, number 1, peace be upon her. Asiya is the wife of the Pharaoh at the time of Moses. Okay, so she actually brought Moses up. And she was the one married to Pharaoh. Pharaoh, of course, thought he was God, and thought that she should be worshipping him. But she, said, no, I worship the one true God. And so she was put to death as a result of her faith. So that's why she's very, a great woman. Khadija was the wife of the Prophet, as I mentioned before, a very pious woman. And so was Fatima, the daughter of the Prophet, peace be upon him. Okay, so all those women are known because of their devoutness. Another incredible woman that's known for her devoutness is Hajara, also known as Hagar. If you think of the story of Abraham, peace be upon him, it's an incredible story. So he is married to Sarah. They cannot have children, and so she gives her handmaiden as a wife to Abraham. Okay, and so from that union comes Ishmael or Ismail. Okay, and then a few, sort of later on, Sarah has Isaac or Ishaq. Peace be upon them both. They're both, Isaac and Ishmael are known as prophets in Islam, so they're both very, very much respected in the faith. But at a certain point in time, the Quran says that God instructs Abraham to take Hajara, to, away. And so he takes her, to this distant land that's actually really sparse. There's nothing growing there. And I have to say, if my husband did that to me, I'd have to say a few things to him. But anyway, Abraham takes her to this far-off land and says, okay, I'm off. And he turns, and she asks him, she says, is this what God intended? Is this what God asked you to do? And he says, yes. And she says, in that case, I will be fine. Which just shows how devout she is and how she believes in God. So he leaves. She's left in this, this valley, this barren place called Bakka, also to be known as Mecca. Okay, and so he leaves her there. She has a few dates and some water. Of course, that finishes off really quickly, and so the baby starts crying and needs to be nursed. So she runs up this hill and looks to see if there's any help. Nothing there. So she runs back down to the other mount, nothing there. And she runs 7 times between the Mount of Safa and the Mount of Safa and Marwa, okay, back and forth 7 times. And on the 7th run, the baby stops crying, and she thinks, oh my gosh, he's died. She runs to him, and she sees this water gushing forth. And there are several narrations. One narration says that Angel Gabriel has come down and nudged the earth with his wing, and that's how the water comes. So what we do, every pilgrim, there are 5 million pilgrims who go each year for the Hajj, for the pilgrimage. We kind of walk in the footsteps of Abraham, but part of the Hajj is walking in the footsteps of this incredible woman, Hajara. So we're supposed to run between these 2 mounts. I walk fast. I'm a bit, sort of scared to run, but I walk really fast between these 2 mounts, and then 7 times, and then we drink from the well of Zamzam. And we remember her story, and we remember her devoutness. And she is an example of a woman that all Muslims, sort of remember during the most important once-in-a-lifetime pilgrimage. So that's a very important thing to note. This is the Mecca. That cube is called the Kaaba, which was the first place of prayer built originally by Adam and then rebuilt by Abraham. All those dots are the 5 million pilgrims that go for the Hajj. And this slide shows you the place. This is Safa, the first mountain, or it's not really a mountain, it's a hill. And so people are going this way and coming this way, and in the middle you have people being pushed on wheelchairs who can't actually walk. But they all do this. They all go between, so this is Safa, and they're walking, I think, towards Marwa. So here's Safa and Marwa, and they walk 7 times in her memory. And to remember how devout she was, what a devout woman she was. I thought I'd talk, I'm coming to the end of my first bit, but I have a lot of pictures which I'll really go really quickly through a little later, in a bit. But I thought I would talk about family life in Islam. If you're a man, it's your responsibility to support your family, okay? Sorry about that, but yeah, that's your responsibility. If you're a woman and you have a job, you don't have that responsibility. When you earn money, it's yours. And if you want to give money to your family, it's a charity. It's not a necessity, which is pretty cool, I think. And that's one of the reasons, when you look at the law books, it says, or the rules of inheritance, it says women can, when they inherit less than men. But the reason for that is men have to look after all their family. The money that goes to women goes to them, and they can keep it. So that's the reason why that happens. And an example, we know about Fatma al-Fihri, who inherited wealth. So that's the reasoning behind that, because lots of people will say that's not fair. But if actually you look at the rules, it's pretty fair in terms of that this is my money, I can keep it, and he has to spend on me as well. So that's what it is like. What else? Women generally have a nurturing responsibility, and they're generally sort of the responsibility to look after their kids. And of course, children have the responsibility and to respect their parents. So really, it says, where do we go from here? It's really up to Muslim women to know our faith. And therefore our rights as Muslims. And we cannot let others define who we are. It's so important that we have education, that we have knowledge. And so I thought I would show you, this is where I do a lot of slides really quick, some examples of Muslim women. This is the stereotype, okay? But let me show you a few other pictures. This is my good friend Rebecca Miner. She's a special ed teacher. She was actually the secretary of the Muslim Coalition of Connecticut, a very vibrant person. This is someone you should think about. It's really interesting. When she was teaching one time, she was in a special ed, she teaches special ed. And one day she was wearing a blue scarf, and it was just before the Christmas time. And this little child said to her, "Are you Mary?" It was very cute, very cute. She sort of loved that. But it was just really cute. This lady, Noor Inayat Khan, there's actually a film made about her. She was actually killed by a firing squad by the Nazis in 1944. And she fought on the side of the British, and she is an example of a Muslim woman. Of course, Queen Rania of Jordan, a well-known woman, also a Muslim woman. We have Begum Khaleda Zia, the Prime Minister of Bangladesh from 91 to 96. An example of a Muslim woman. I'm sorry to say we're still waiting for a woman president in this country. I thought I wouldn't have to say that, but I have to say that now. But Bangladesh is a Muslim country. Tansu Çiller was Prime Minister of Turkey, another Muslim country, in 1993, from 1993 to 95, and she still remains an active politician. Benazir Bhutto, daughter of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, educated in Harvard. She was the president of the Oxford Union, a very prestigious position. She served as prime minister in 2 terms and was killed in 2007 as a result of a suicide bombing. Megawati Sukarno Putri was the president of Indonesia from 2001 to 2004. Indonesia, of course, being the most populous Muslim country in the world. Sheikh Hasina is presently the prime minister of Bangladesh today, another Muslim woman. One of my friends went to China, and she visited various places in China. And it is interesting to note that there are 130 million Muslims in China, I never realized that. And there are also all-women mosques, which are led by female imams. And that's a really unique thing, something that I think I should, sort of know more about. but it's an amazing thing. The person who discovered the astrolabe, al-astrolabi, was a Muslim woman in the 10th century. Fatima al-Fikhri, I already mentioned her, was someone who inherited wealth. I was looking all over the place. I finally found an all-woman flight deck crew from the Brunei Airlines. I found a colonel who flies her helicopter to some of the most dangerous parts in Afghanistan. Of course, doctors. Layla Haddad is a doctor in Dearborn, Michigan, so that's a very common thing among Muslim women. Susan Barakat was in the news, and she was actually, unfortunately, her brother was killed, and his wife and her sister were also killed. And it took a long time, if you look up the story, it took a long time for them to realize, to admit that it was a hate crime. And it took a lot of effort from this family to get that out. Dr. Ingrid Mattson is a good friend of mine, founder of the Islamic Chaplaincy Program at the Harvard Seminary. She was also the president of the Islamic Society of North America, which is the biggest Muslim organization in the United States. An incredible woman. She's written some fantastic books. Rabia Chowdhury, I don't know if you're aware of the webcast Serial. It was one of the most popular webcasts ever. And it featured this young man, Adnan Syed. She's actually an attorney, and she's still fighting for his release from prison. I thought I found these incredible women. This is Iqbal al-Assad. She actually became a doctor at the age of 20 from Cornell, actually the Qatar's branch of Cornell. And so she took her oath as a doctor when she was just 20. I found another Muslim woman who got a perfect score on the SATs a couple of years ago, Mariam Raza. She is also an example of a Muslim woman. So do not think of all those, sort of the stereotype. Think of these women, okay? Mubaraka Ibrahim is a good friend of mine. She lives in New Haven. She's a personal trainer. She's been on Oprah, which is, her thing. I found some pictures of policewomen who wore the headscarf. This young woman, Nadia Hussein, she actually won the bake-off competition and ended up making the Queen's birthday cake. Okay, it's beautiful, right? Another example of a Muslim woman. Qadra Muhammad is the first hijab-wearing policewoman in Minnesota. Okay, we have the gold medalist Delilah Muhammad, who won the gold medal in the 400 meters hurdles. She is an example of a Muslim woman. Ibtihaj Muhammad won the bronze. She's a fencer. She won the bronze in 2016. She is another example of a Muslim woman. Hamida Abbasali, she's an Iranian karate world champion. I found a weightlifter from Pakistan who's also, incredible. Bilkis Abdul Qadir, she is the first Massachusetts high school basketball player to score more than 3,000 points. And she did this all while wearing her headscarf. Shireen Ebadi, she's an Iranian lawyer. She actually got the Nobel Peace Prize in 2003. I think one of the first women from that region to receive it. Tawakkul Karman is another woman who won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2011. She's a Yemeni journalist, activist, incredible woman. Malala Yousafzai, of course, is the youngest ever person who happens to be a Muslim woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize in 2014. Sumbul Ali Karamari is an author. I love this as a good reference, and I love the title. It says, "The Muslim Next Door, the Quran, the Media, and that veil thing." She's a lawyer. She's written a lot of articles. One really good article on Sharia, which is you can Google it, and it's available. Dalia Mogahed, she actually came on Trevor Noah's, what's his program? I'm blanking out. The Daily Show, yes, The Daily Show. And she actually spoke about women, why we think that, they had a discussion about why they think that taking off clothing is something that shows how liberated you are. Why should it be? And she made a very good point. I thought that was an excellent interview. But she was actually selected as an advisor by President Obama in the White House. This incredible woman, El-Shiba Khan, she came to know when, at the time, in 2008, Colin Powell was supporting Barack Obama's candidature as president. And there was this whole thing about McCain being asked about President Obama, and she said, "Is he he's an Arab?" And Senator McCain said, "He's not an Arab. He's a good man," which was an unfortunate way that it sounded wrong, but he probably didn't mean it that way. But it sounded really bad. But what he said is, what if a 7-year-old Muslim kid wants to be president? And what really made him think about it was this photo. It was a photo essay of a mother at her son's grave. Her son was 19 when he passed. He was killed and his name was Karim Rashad Sultan Khan, and he died in Operation Iraqi Freedom. And what Colin Powell said was that few people actually think about the American Muslim population. And that was the first time, this population was mentioned by someone of that caliber. So it was an incredible day for us. I remember it very clearly. It was a Sunday. We all discussed it at Sunday school. It was very interesting. So this is a quote from Queen Rania. She says, "We really have to move beyond the premise of viewing Islam as being anti-women. It is not. Islam really does grant women their rights to educate themselves, to enter the workplace, to participate in society. These are the rights given to women in Islam. It is a misconception to always view Muslim women as oppressed." I think really education is the key. I actually found an astronaut who was a woman, and I thought I would share that with you, and she hopes to inspire people. Her name is Anusha Ansari, first Muslim woman in space. And of course, I love this quote. This is "One child, one teacher, one book, and one pen can change the world," says Malala Yousafzai. As I said, education is the key. And I thought, when we are educated, our hate and fear can turn into respect and love. And, there is a lot of hatred, going around. There was a story about how we have a thing called the bikini, which is really a modest swimsuit, really. So it basically covers as much as we can cover, but we can swim in a regular swimming pool. And it's pretty cool. But this is, in France, they actually banned it because they thought it was too, Muslim. And so this is a picture of a policeman asking this woman to remove her bathing suit on a Nice beach. Fortunately, now that rule has been overturned, but it just shows what, when you don't know about a faith, when you make judgments about a faith, what can happen. And so that's why it's so important to be aware of each other and to get to know one another on a human level, because we tend to make these huge judgment calls when we don't know each other personally. And so that's one of the things we have to fight for. So these are some useful references, and I'll share them with you. If anyone wants a copy of this, please, let me know and I'll send it to you. Ingrid Matsson's. This is a great movie if you're interested. It's called Arranged. It talks about a Muslim woman who is getting her parents are arranging her marriage, and an Orthodox Jewish woman, her parents are trying to get her married, and they help each other. So it's really cool. It's a nice ending. So it's a good movie. This movie called Maryam, it actually deals with the hijab and the hijab ban in France, and it does a really good job in terms of conveying, like they make these judgments like, she's just wearing the headscarf, and she actually conveys the reason why she's wearing it. And it's a very well done movie. So this is nearly my final slide, I promise. The Prophet was asked, as a mother, who should you show kindness to the most? And the Prophet said, to your mother. And after that, who? And he said, to your mother a second time. And after that, who? And he said, to your mother a third time. And after that, who should you show kindness to the most? And then he said, and then to your father. So I have this thing at home that I deserve 3/4 of the love, right? Mother, 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 father. And then there's another tradition that says that paradise lies under the feet of the mother. And with that, I'll show you a picture of my kids. These are my two. This is Yasmin, named after the flower jasmine, okay? When we name our kids, we're supposed to name them with either strong names or beautiful names or something that's positive. Never call your child grasshopper. It's not good. Anyway, so this is my daughter Yasmin, named after the beautiful fragrant flower of jasmine, and this is my son Yusuf, named after the prophet Joseph, of course, Yusuf alayhi salam. And I thought I would just end with this photograph. So my husband is a physician. He's a cardiologist, and usually we try and, he's on call a lot. So when he's home, we get him, we eat with him, and then we pray with him. Those are the two things we try to do with him as a family. So what we do is we put our prayer rugs, we wash, we put our prayer rugs out in the direction of Mecca when we pray. And then after the prayer, we make a supplication or dua, okay? And so usually my husband will have this long thing that, things that he says, and then I'll go. And then my daughter goes. And then this is the first time my son Yusuf ever made a supplication. So I took a photograph. And this photograph is genuine because you can see Elmo in the background, right? Can you see Elmo in the background? It's a genuine photograph. So anyway, he's like this, and he's saying, Ya Allah, oh God, thank you for my parents. Thank you for the shelter that we have. Thank you for my big sister. And of course, he's saying that because we told him to say that bit. But then he says, but most of all, thank you for my Lion King toys. I love them very, very, very much. And so I end with this photograph because it brings me down to earth. And I have to tell you that my son is now 20 years old. Right? He doesn't look as cute as this now. Well, he's still cute. But if you were ever to see him, do not mention that you saw these photographs, because he always says to me, you didn't show those photographs, did you, Mom? So please, don't talk about it. But I would like to thank you all for being so patient. I know I've gone a little over, and I wanted to get more. Let's get some questions. I'm sorry I went on, but thank you all very much. Oh, and the other thing is, I have, this is a leaflet about Muslim women, and I have quite a few, so please, I'll put them in the back, and please help yourself to those. But questions, yes?
Okay, we have about 10 and 12 minutes for questions. Okay, and I'll do my best.
I have one question. You've described very well-educated women in many instances who come from good backgrounds. When we see things on the news in other countries, I'm not talking about the United States, where schoolgirls are forced back into the school to burn rather than to expose their arms.
I know.
What do you, as educated Muslim women, what is your role, and what weight is on you to represent a voice against this?
That's a heavy question. But thank you. It is very, very frustrating. So this story that you're talking about is there was a fire and in Arabia, and these women ran out and they weren't covered. So they sent them back into the fire and they died. And that really shows you how much ignorance there is about the faith. So really, I would push for more education. But when these things happen, it's heartbreaking. It's very, very heartbreaking. But we need to get that word out. We need to really educate. We really need more education, and it's sometimes, it's like you're beating your head against a wall. But that's really the way that we can get around these things, I feel. And of course, more women need to be active and activists. And it's quite promising. You see women who are really going against the grain and fighting for rights for women all over the world, whether it's in this country or in other countries. It's very promising to see that. But sometimes people wait to hit rock bottom before they do anything. And I hope, and I pray that we can make a difference. But I think education is key. But thank you for your question, and I'll be thinking about that. Yeah.
My question is basically based on my ignorance, and that is on talaq, which is divorce, and inheritance.
Yes.
And meher.
Yes.
Now, I know some people who are products of an interracial marriage, Hindu and Muslim, and the mother, normally in a Hindu society, it's separate patriarchal society, and if you inherit your father's name. This girl had to inherit her mother's name to inherit that property that the mother had. I couldn't understand that.
Okay, that sounds like there's a lot of detail, right, in that we should know about. Generally speaking, and I've seen like 18th century marriage certificates, right? And the women actually in the 18th century were amazing. So they would say in their marriage document that they want so much of money if there is a divorce. And of course, in Islam, marriage is a contract. We don't promise to do anything. It's a contract, and so whoever sort of signs their name, so divorce is allowed. In different areas, people have more right. It's easier to get a divorce or less easy to get a divorce depending on the place. I don't know enough about this particular case. But generally speaking, I think it's up to us as women. I mean, when I got married and people said, how much do you want to write for mahar? I didn't, you're so happy to get married, you don't think of those things. But it's so important that we educate this next generation to know their rights and to talk about it seriously. Because when I was getting married, I didn't think about it. And so I said, like, $200 or something ridiculous, which isn't good. And this is the money that's supposed to support me. So it's very important that we take it very seriously.
And my second question, and my last, this will be my last. If you could please talk about Muslim genital, women's genitals.
Yes, so the mutilation thing? So I think I mentioned it a little. It's a cultural practice. It's not Islamic. People will say, when there has been writing about it, people say it should be minimal, if at all. Okay, when they quote the Prophet, he says not this invasive, crazy practice that happens. And so when you read the Hadith, it kind of says, you shouldn't hurt. So one of the things we shouldn't do is hurt the human body, right? We're supposed to not be able to do. What happens when someone dies? You do a post-mortem. So you're not supposed to be doing
An autopsy.
An autopsy. Yes. So you're sort of, if you can avoid doing those things, you should. Okay. A tattoo also is seen as sort of hurting the human body. But you see women in Algeria, their faces are tattooed. So culturally, it's a cultural practice. The female genital mutilation thing is a cultural practice. I know women from Guinea who, their mothers had this practice. Very, very invasive, very painful. When you have, when you get married, it's having relations with your husband is a very painful thing, and having a baby is also a very painful thing. And that just, is not Islamic. But it happens.
No, yeah, and they're happening in the royal families of the Middle East.
Right. Yes. So that's the point, is that it's happening in certain areas.
Encouraged by the women of the bride.
Yes, but it's not an Islamic practice. It's a cultural practice. And that's what I want to emphasize, is that Muslim women have this practice, but it's not an Islamic practice. They have this practice because they're in a certain area on the globe. And that's the problem.
About 10 years ago, we were in London, and we saw women in full burqa in London. And it was probably my stereotype to think, well, if she's in London, where you obviously don't have to be in full burqa, her husband must be insisting that she wear it. And I think my eyes have been opened now. You lived in England.
I was born in England.
Yes. And a woman who might wear a full burqa on the streets of London, what might be her rationale?
Okay, so probably that's what she's used to. Okay, if you were to go to Afghanistan, if you were to go to Kabul during the time of the Taliban, everybody wore those blue things. Christina Amanpour did a whole segment on it. She had the camera underneath and was looking through this mesh. I don't know if you remember that. But Now, if you were to go to Kabul, the women are, very educated and before the Taliban, they weren't in the huge, in the burqa. But if you go in the outskirts, the women dress like that, okay? And I have to say, if there's a certain way that women dress, if I were to go there dressed like this to a place where the norm was a burqa, I would probably, people probably think that I was a pretty loose woman, maybe, possibly, because it's going against the regular clothing of the normative clothing. But I think every individual is so specific and so unique. So, if this woman was that, maybe it's possible that her husband could be forcing her, which is not an Islamic thing to do, but he may have been forcing her. And maybe it was her choice. That's also a possibility. We'll never know unless we get to her right here and talk to her. But, the point is that there are 1.7 billion Muslims on earth. And we can't put every Muslim into a box. And that's what we tend to do. We say, oh, they're Muslim, and just, have all these stereotypes. So it's important to see that we are very, very diverse in our practice and in our interpretation, and that and I think we should rejoice in that diversity. But yeah, that's a good question. Yes, thank you.
I have a question. In the Quran, I don't remember if it's chapter 8 or 9 or another chapter, I don't remember. It says in there, do not be friends with Christians and Jews because they are friends with each other. And I think that's crazy, because why can't you be friends with Christians and Jews just because they're friends with each other?
Right, yes. So that's, yeah. So the thing is about those kinds of quotes is usually they're translations. And the other thing is, so it may be a wonky translation, but more likely it's taken out of context. So usually something like that, it would be pertaining to a specific, maybe a battle or something very specific, and it's talking about that tribe and that tribe. And what we do as regular human beings is we can take that and tweak it a little to suit our own ends. And lots of people who quote those particular verses in that way, have got an agenda. Many are, Islamophobic, a lot of, if you go to the Islamophobic sites, they'll be full of those kinds of quotes. So really we need to know the context. I think that's one of the most important things, and also realize that it's a translation, and a lot is lost in translation. So those two things. But I know as a Muslim that Christians and Jews are people of the book, who are to be respected. There are many quotes, very positive quotes about how we should live together and and rejoice in our diversity. So it doesn't really add up in terms of how we are supposed to be. Because when I read the Quran, when it's very plain to me when it says about how these are all people who believe. Muslims, Jews, Christians, and even the Sabians. And I don't know much about the Sabians, but they mention those four populations as people of the book. And there's a lot of respect. There's a lot of respect when the Prophet Jesus is described, peace be upon him, when the Prophet Moses is described, peace be upon him, and of course when the Prophet Abraham is described. So there's a lot of respect with all these leaders of these different faiths, and it doesn't make sense that we can't get along. And if you see the example of the Prophet, he actually went out of his way to get along with folks.
I have to get everyone out of the library in 7 minutes. I'm very sorry. I'm sorry, that's all the time we have for questions. We have to close in 7 minutes. We do have to leave.
If anyone has any more questions, I can give you my email, and I will try my best to answer them the best I can. And if I don't know the answer to it, I'll refer you to someone who does. But if you have a burning question and you need it answered, please take my email. Okay, thank you all very, very much. Thank you.